With the emergence of 4K gaming monitors becoming more prevalent and more manufacturers getting into the hype of next-gen console performance and of course RTX 30 performance, AMD 6000 performance, you know, it's no surprise that the next one I have up in front of me is this Acer Nitro XV282K, and it is their 4K 144Hz HDMI 2.1 gaming monitor. Today what we're going to be doing is diving deep into the performance metrics. We're going to be doing real world gaming in quite a few different titles and talking about what I found when benchmarking some of the features that they tout on this monitor. So that's all coming up on today's video. The Acer Nitro is a 28-inch 4K resolution, 144Hz, 1 millisecond response rate, IPS, and what they call their Agile Splendor IPS panel. This thing packs 400 peak nits of brightness. It has a HDR 400 certification. It is AMD FreeSync Premium, and it is G-Sync compatible. It hits 99% of that sRGB scale for you creators out there. And of course, it packs the HDMI 2.1 certification, although there is an asterisk there. But you will get full functionality from Xbox Series S and X. And then with the PS5, it does say you can get 1080p HDR, 120 frames per second, and 4K HDR, 120 frames per second. Now, the Acer Nitro aesthetics are fantastic. I love the designs of their actual stands. This stand has a full height adjustment. It has tilting capability. It has rotation to go into that portrait mode, and then it pans from left to right. There is no RGB lighting on this guy, but that's okay. The back looks pretty aggressive. It has a nice brushed metal look. It has a passive cooling that adds to the aggressive factor. The stand itself has some cool writing along the back. Some notable mentions would be the fact that it has cable management along the back with a red clip holding your wires in place. And then the joystick that controls the menu is actually a reasonable size. It's easy to reach when that monitor is set up on your desk. In the box with your display, of course, you get an HDMI cable, your power supply, you get a display port cable, you get USB-C, and then of course a standard USB cable. As far as I/O on the back, this guy has two HDMI 2.1s. Your display port, you're gonna get a USB-C, which is fantastic. You're gonna get a USB upstream, and then count them, four USB 3.0s for you to plug in those peripherals and use as an upstream style connection. But a notable mention here is the fact that it doesn't just have a 3.5 millimeter for your headphones or external speakers. It does have speakers built into the display, although I would probably tell you to use something probably a bit better. So as always, you guys, when I pull out a monitor for the first time, I go through those menus to see what kind of control we get for calibration, and I'll put a calibration down below. I did use a Spider X on this particular monitor. The results were really good. You do get 8 presets. I wouldn't say those presets are fantastic, but the standard user mode, the custom user mode, wasn't that great either. In fact, what I found was that the HDR preset was probably the best out of all the 8 there, although if you do want to do a custom calibration, you do need to be into that user mode to do that, because the HDR preset limits your control over the color, the brightness of the display. So be careful when doing that. It will lock you out of some menus, much like most monitors on the market. I do have to say that this calibration was done based on the lighting in my room. What I found as a result was, just as this monitor describes, it does cover and hit 99% of the sRGB scale. It does hit 83% of the Adobe RGB scale, and then it hits 87% of the DCI-P3 color scale. So on the last topic of setup and menus here, I went to the ISO monitor test just to see if there's any dead pixels, and then of course, as always, to look at that gray uniformity test. Of course, on the green test here, I noticed something on my display. I thought it was a dead pixel, so I wiped it off. It wasn't a dead pixel, luckily. Now, stopping on this gray uniformity, it's not exactly perfect, but that's the inherent issue with IPS. IPS kind of has that glow to it. And this monitor specifically has local dimming edge-lit display, and that local dimming isn't very effective because it's not like TV technology. I would say the gray uniformity, just like the Acer Nitro that we just reviewed, the XV272, it does okay. So before we get into the in-depth testing on Blurbusters with pixel response rate, motion testing, things like that, I want to jump into Borderlands 3 because it's a fantastic way to test the color saturation and accuracy of a monitor like this. So I went into Windows, I turned HDR on, I turned max brightness on, and kind of pumped up that brightness. Otherwise, it's actually fairly dark, but I do get that dialed in and jump into a bit of gameplay, and this is what I found. So immediately what I will tell you is the fact that this monitor itself does have a bit of a blue haze over it, but that doesn't mean that the reds and the greens don't pop. They do pop really well. And in fact, what I notice here is actually a black level performance increase from the XV272 and some of the other monitors that I've reviewed in the past, specifically also the M28U, although it did really well in this test. So like, this is a very simple scene. I'm not doing too much, but you have a bush here, a tree, and then some corners that really kind of have a bunch of dark areas in them. And what I notice is that you can still see the corners and the shadows and the detail within this tree. It's not crushing that detail. So it's doing a good job overall in contrast. It's not perfect. It's definitely not OLED performance. It's maybe not even VA performance. Overall, I was impressed here with Borderlands 3. The only downside here being that kind of blue note to the screen. Woo buddy, was this a mixed bag for Blurbusters today? I feel like the tests were kind of all over the place. There were some good things, there were some bad things, and we're going to be definitely jumping into those good and bad things. But before we do, I want to let you know we have a fantastic channel built out for you guys, all about monitors, console monitors, 4K, 1440p, 1080p. There's tons of playlists on that channel. So go check out that homepage, find a playlist that you like. Watch it through. You'll probably find a monitor that's on your list. You'll be able to see the full review on the channel. And as always, subscribe to the channel. We appreciate those who have. It's kept us going this far, and we definitely want to keep going. So let's smash that like button and move forward into the Blurbusters testing, starting with refresh rate. So 144 Hertz is powered on. We have, of course, low, medium, high as far as frames per second. The bottom frame is kind of skipping along, but that's a low 30s frame per second. Just on my initial pause here, what I noticed is that 144 Hertz, we're seeing a bit of overshoot here, but the bottom two frames, even though they're skipping along that 35 and about 70 frames per second, are looking very solid, no ghosting or overshoot. And I always like to pause a second time just to see how it reacts differently. And what we notice in that top 144 Hertz refresh rate is a bit of ghosting. So you can expect to probably see some motion blur within game, but depends on the overall performance. And maybe this is a scenario where the extreme setting would do better, which we will test in just a second. Well, I don't think anything's going to beat that Acer Nitro 280 Hertz monitor in this world motion blur test, but this did hold up really well in this motion blur test. As we watch this just pan along, that lower frame, the 144 Hertz, is doing fantastic. It's very, very smooth, while that 30 frames per second up top, it's just kind of skipping along. As we stop, what we see is a perfect picture on both top and bottom. So it's not blurring those frames that are incoming. It's able to refresh really well in that pixel response rate. It's not doing it to a point where we're getting tons of ghosting. Okay, moving on to the pixel response rate test here with this Acer Nitro. And of course, we're going to be testing the three options that it has, and that is off, normal, and extreme, with extreme being, of course, the highest pixel refresh rate that we get. And we are going to be testing that on three refresh rates: 144 Hertz, about 70 Hertz, and 35 Hertz. So let's dive in and see what we find with the pixel overdrive being off. First pause is looking fantastic. Pixel response rate looking great with the pixel overdrive off. And what we've seen lately with a lot of different monitors and their technology they use for their overdrive settings, you're actually usually better off with this thing off. This was the case with the M28U. It performed just as well with those pixel overdrive being off than it did with even their best setting, which was like normal or something along those lines. Okay, and of course, there's always one bad apple in the bunch here. This was a pause that I found where there was actually a noticeable amount of ghosting going on. And I'm capturing at 120 frames per second, but what we can see, top, middle, and bottom frame is the same amount of ghosting between all of them. Now, switching over to normal, you would expect probably a little bit of an increase in performance here, and that's kind of what we see initially out of the box here. We get a perfect picture out of all three refresh rates, looking fantastic, no overshoot, no ghosting whatsoever. This is performing better than I expected. So I do want to bring up the second pause here because there is a teeny bit of ghosting here at the top frame, the 144 hertz. Not much going on the other two frames here. Even at that 144 hertz refresh rate, the normal overdrive setting seems like it's leaving a bit of trailing ghost here. So jumping into the extreme overdrive, initially as I pause for the first time, I'm getting the similar result as I am to the previous test that we've done. But I do notice on the lowest frame per second and even the middle frame per second, we're getting just a hair of ghosting. Not a lot though. While that 144 hertz at the top looks perfect. Now, as we take that second pause though, that's where things start to fall apart here for this Acer Nitro in the extreme setting. That top frame, that 144 hertz and that middle frame do have some ghosting. Now, it's improved over the normal, but under all circumstances, it entirely depends on the refresh rate that you consistently play on. Even though I've seen ghosting between all three settings, this extreme, it's not perfect, leading me to say that I could probably use any three of these settings. In fact, I would probably tell you to keep it on normal because it's actually an in-between of the two, meaning that most games that you play, you won't have any major issues with ghosting and response rate and things like that. So enough with the in-depth kind of synthetic benchmarking here. I want to get into some real-world gameplay, and I use the calibration that I have down below in the description of the video. So if you want to know exactly how this was running, go down there, check it out, and you can actually use it for your own monitor if you like the results here. But what I will point out and what we are about to test is 4K HDR. So I turned HDR in the Windows settings on, and we jumped into a bit of Back 4 Blood and some gameplay throughout that, and this is what I found. So Back 4 Blood is just inherently a very dark game. On a panel like this with 400 peak nits of brightness, I'm actually pretty happy with the performance. Just like in Borderlands 3, where the contrast was doing a pretty decent job, in Back 4 Blood, it kind of presents itself the same way. It's not 100% perfect, and I think on a VA panel, you would get better performance. But the color accuracy and the detail that you get on this 4K display in HDR mode is just fantastic. Like this particular scene, you can tell here, you guys, you can absolutely tell that it's very dark. It's kind of hard to see some of the detail. Now, it's not perfect, but as I pause right here on this scene, we have this giant guy over here, and he's swinging his arm to take out my opponents. And in the middle of that swing, I pause, and that motion is just fantastic. We're not seeing a massive amount of ghosting. We can see this sick trail of blood just follow his arm as he swings towards the opponent here, and we're making out decent detail. And I think this interaction here just about wraps it up for this monitor performance on 4K HDR. And it's the fact that I'm aiming up at something totally opposite of where the zombie comes to attack me. And as I turn my 90 degrees to go shoot this zombie here, what I see is very, very, very minimal motion blur to the actual zombie, but there is some up here off in the distance. Immediately in front of me, that zombie has a perfect outline, perfect detail to the body here. You can even make out, well, what kind of looks like tattoos, but obviously probably rotting flesh. And, you know, hey, that sums up this game so far. So as much as I love Back 4 Blood, and I think it's a fantastic game, it's definitely not as good at testing HDR color as this next game that we have here. And that's the Metro Exodus Enhanced RTX version. There's just no question, no doubt in my mind that it should look fantastic on this monitor. So as always, I do a little side-by-side test here with HDR on and HDR off, and what we see is the game just underperforms with HDR off. HDR performance does extremely well, whereas you may not see these benefits in other games. But side-by-side, obviously, we see that the picture is blown out in a non-HDR setting. And moving forward, a couple of these cutscenes, I mean, just brilliant color accuracy, the tone to the skin, the motion overall. overall, the color of the backdrop, the kind of rustic look, the beat up and tattered look of the actual van they're in. Just a lot of detail on this 4K display. So I just want to pause right here on this scene because this says a lot about this monitor. We have that sun right in the back behind the little overpass here and the reflection coming down onto the pathway. And as I move around, that reflection obviously changes with me. It's ray traced. But overall, I mean, the clarity and detail that you get here is fantastic. We have some dark areas off to the right where it's not crushing the detail. You're still able to get a good amount of texture and resolution out of that fence line. Just the jump from, say, 1440p up to 4K like this in a game like Metro Exodus Enhanced with HDR performance on, I mean, just fantastic. This game blows me away every time that I play it. Last pause, I promise you guys, because this scene blew me away. And it's this water with this reflection and the ripples happening real time. And then that sun over the church steeple here. And then that blue sky. I mean, if you look at this sky, it looks real. It looks like something you would see in real life. And that's a combination of the game, the graphics card, and of course the monitor capping it off, giving us that sweet color and realistic viewing type picture that we see here. So next up is Valorant, and as one great viewer put it to me not long ago, I need to work on my aim skills in Valorant, and that is 100% true. Even though I did brush up on my aim skills a bit, I jumped in and tested out overall motion capability. This is what I found. So once again, we know my aim sucks, but let's just watch this next part here. I turn around this corner after this guy takes out my team. I'm taking a couple shots at him with a pistol. I'm not moving extremely fast, but even as I pause in the middle of that interaction here, zero ghosting, zero. At 144 hertz, 1 millisecond response rate on normal, we're getting a fantastic motion capability out of Valorant. So that was pretty much the case for all interactions, except for this next one. And I want to go back a little bit. Let's take a look at it. As I creep around the corner, I kind of see this guy peeking his head out. He's hiding behind these green blocks there. And I take a couple shots, I miss, and I'm like, oh, I have to do something evasive. So I jump, and in the middle of that jump, what we do start to see is a bit of ghosting. We see that in his character, we see that in my character, and that goes back to the Blurbusters test that we did. As we saw more motion, faster paced motion, even at 144 hertz, there's inherently a bit of motion blur, but no monitor's perfect. So last interaction here, I block one guy so he can't shoot me as I go around the corner to track down his opponent. And as I round that corner, he's coming at me, and it's not extremely fast paced, I will say that. With the movement happening and the gunfire happening at the same time, everything's perfect. I mean, the motion capability, fantastic. I couldn't ask for more in a game like Valorant, and that's pretty much what I'll say. If you're playing Valorant and you have questions about this monitor, hands down, this should be on your list. But I think the true test is on something probably a bit more involved and faster paced, and of course that's going to be Call of Duty Warzone. The color is holding up strong here. The blue of the water is great. I'm getting great detail in the texture on the ground. You know, like the greens are greens, the brown are brown. We're even picking up the tiles on top of decon here, so looking great. And then we get into a bit of fast-paced action here at the bottom of prison, and we see a few of the downsides come out in this monitor. Once again, the contrast isn't fantastic. Is it unplayable? Absolutely not. But on this interaction here, as I'm aiming down sights on the other side of prison, I see another individual, an opponent. I can hardly make out his character. It's almost like this black shadow kind of drops and then goes out of scene here. So kind of hard to spot and shoot. And then within that same interaction, I spin around because somebody's attacking me from behind. And as I make that spin, again, kind of hard to make out the character, but the motion's holding up strong here. I turn around, there's a teeny bit of motion blur throughout me turning, to be expected, but as I aim down sights, his character's right there. I'm able to make him out, take him down, even though I'm down a plate and he's got the jump on me. I can't find anywhere where there's bad motion within this gameplay. So there is one thing I noticed about this monitor that I didn't like in this particular game. And it kind of goes back to the main thing we've talked about this whole time. And it's the fact that The brightness level and the contrast on this are a bit funky. There's really only a couple of presets and ways to calibrate this guy to get a good contrast in black level performance. And what that causes, especially in this game, is as you aim down sights and you have your red dot, it's over enhancing that brightness. It's blowing out the detail in that red dot sight. The one thing I will say is, compared to the XV272, this actually does better in the bright areas. It doesn't blow out the display as much as that monitor did. So there is some more give in that bright top level performance. And I think it's worth the extra money you pay to a degree, but you have to factor in the games that you play here. The brightness could be a bit too much for you in order to get all of the detail you want out of the display. Now, where this monitor may lack in some black level performance and really bright areas, it picks up for in motion capability and overall detail and color accuracy. Just like this next scene here, there's some good fast-paced action happening, so I want to break it down for you. And what we see is me kind of getting hit from behind. Guy flies in on top of prison and he hits that little window that takes you into that second level rather than being on top. 90-degree spin, really fast, take some shots at this dude to take him down. Not only are we getting great detail in the image quality, but zero ghosting, zero. And again, I'm on normal pixel response rate. We're up at like 140 plus frames per second at 4K resolution. This says it all to me. Would you rather have great motion capability, great pixel response rate with fantastic resolution and color? Or would you rather have something that's worse with pixel response rate and motion and better with overall black level performance? I don't think there is a one size fits all unless you go to OLED, which we know in a monitor this size with this performance level, these similar specs, is going to cost you 3-4 times what this monitor does. Well, this has been a fun monitor to personally use and test for the last couple of weeks, and I've definitely put it through its paces. The downsides that I'll mention to you to watch out for if you are looking at this monitor would first be that contrast. Even though it performed better than the XV272, this still lacks a bit in that overall contrast capability. Which leads me to say that one of the big features we all look for is overall pixel response rate. And this is marketed as a 1 millisecond gray to gray pixel response rate. And when in that extreme setting, that extreme overdrive, what we saw within our testing on Blurbusters was that overdrive wasn't amazing, which leads me to the third downside, and it's the fact that at $899, it's kind of a hard sell when looking at comparing it to the Gigabyte M28U. Pound for pound, these two actually perform very similar. However, I will say there is just something about this particular monitor that makes it feel a bit more high-end. Which leads me to the upsides, and starting with the Agile Splendor IPS display. It outperforms the M28U in color performance through and through. The second benefit is the fact that it has fantastic motion in first-person shooter games. Games that need that full 144 Hz capability. Warzone alone shows us that the motion and pixel response rate when left on normal and at 144 Hz, this does fantastic and reacts probably among the best 144 Hz monitors I've reviewed. And then the last benefit, this matches up quite nicely to something like the M28U from Gigabyte, and it's the fact that it has a good amount of I/O. It even gives you 2 additional USB 3.0 ports here and 2 on the back, so you get 4 altogether. And then of course, cap that off with the HDMI 2.1. It is a compressed HDMI 2.1. Nonetheless, it does give you that HDMI 2.1 4K HDR 120 Hz that you will want. But at the end of the day, do those benefits make up for some of the downsides? And my answer to you is that if you're looking at HDMI 2.1 monitors or 4K 144 Hz monitors, it would probably be the M28U at the top so far, and this Acer Nitro right behind it. There are a few areas where I would tell you to look for this monitor. And obviously with stock being limited, that would be one of those areas. But if you're a console gamer, you probably want to stick to the M28U. However, if you're a PC gamer, There are actually benefits in having this over the Gigabyte M28U, and it solely relies on color performance and overall motion capability. It did eke out the win, in my opinion, in those two areas, and those factors mean a lot when you're PC gaming, much more than they do on console. But I'm not going to give an absolute resolution. I would say there's probably about 30% of the time that I would recommend this monitor over something like the M28U. But if you take that M28U out of the picture, where does it stack up against other monitors that are available, such as like the Odyssey G70? Well, I don't know yet, but I do have that monitor here and I will be testing it over the next week or two. So please hit the subscribe button and notification bell so you can see when that goes live. That really wraps it up for me, you guys. I've done a lot of in-depth testing. I'm gonna keep testing. There's gonna be a video on the Xbox Series S and X for you to check out, but that's all I can really say. So I appreciate you guys for sticking around and listening to me go on about my recommendation and this monitor. And I hope to see you on the next video, you guys. All right, we'll catch you later.